Afternoon. I'm Ann Lazar, the Executive Director of the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation. And on behalf of the Driehaus Foundation, we are proud to support the festival and underwrite today's program. The Wrigley Building is one of Chicago's most emblematic buildings. Today's panel discussion looks at Chicago-based creatives behind the new book, The Wrigley Building, The Making of an Icon, will be an unveiling of fresh perspectives on the architectural marvels that it is, providing a fascinating social history illuminating the building's significance as more than just a structural landmark, but as a nexus of Chicago's cultural, social, and business evolution. Please join me in welcoming photographer William Zabarin, writer Robert Sharrock, cultural historian Tim Samuelson, architect and historian John Vinci, and our moderator, writer, and editor, Alison Cunn. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Oh, thanks so much for coming. All right, well, let's get started. One thing I learned putting this presentation together is that it's almost impossible. Oh, there's my daughter and Ralphie. It's almost impossible to squeeze a 400-page book into a half-hour presentation. I mean, for one thing, you have to leave so much out, like this. Oop. No, there was, oh my God, there. We'll start there. Go ahead. This was a movie made in 1959, starring Peter Graves and an actress named professionally as Cheesecake, and involves atomically radiated grasshoppers attacking the Wrigley Building. Or how about this photo? What's going on here? This is a photo of Wrigley employees hooked up to a machine that is measuring their saliva levels while they are chewing gum. This was part of an experiment to see if chewing gum had health benefits. It turns out it doesn't. There are a lot of stories like this in the book, but today, we're going to talk about how the building actually came to be. First of all, this book would not have happened without the participation of two people. One of them, of course, is Joe Mansueto, the owner of the Wrigley Building. Joe commissioned this book 4 years ago and has been a steadfast partner and patron through thick and thin, and there was a lot of both. The other person is Diane McFadden. When we began this project 4 years ago, it did not occur to me that I would be able to speak with someone who had actually known Charles Biersman, the architect of the Wrigley Building. Charles Biersman died back in 1946, almost 80 years ago. And at best, I thought maybe there would be a grandchild somewhere out there I could find. I searched for obituaries and immediately found one for Biersman's son, Jack, who died in the 1980s. And I kept looking for Diane. After weeks spent stumbling around the internet, I found an address and a phone number in Stonington, Connecticut. I called, and her first words were, "How did you find me?" She sounded old and raspy. She was 92 years old. I told her about the book, and she got really excited. I realized she had been waiting for years to talk about her father, who she adored, and who had died when she was 18. She told me she had saved everything she could, photos, paintings, drawings, and would I like to see them? And at that point, I got really excited. The only problem was that this was during COVID, and none of us, not me, not Bill or Tim, had been vaccinated. And I told her we'd come out as soon as we could after we got the shot. And she said, "That's fine, but you better come soon because I'm not well. I have COPD." And for the next 3 weeks, we talked or exchanged emails almost every day. She had an astounding memory. I mean, how many people do you know who still remember going to the 1933 World's Fair She did. She also remembered how her father would sit with her at the kitchen table. They lived up in Evanston. Patiently help her with her math homework. She also remembered that his favorite greeting was, "What's your new idea?" 3 weeks later, I stopped hearing from her, and then I received an email from her daughter saying her mother had gone into hospice and she died a week later. It's a genuinely odd thing to get to know someone in the last 2, 3 weeks of their very long life. It seemed mystical to me. Charles Biersman was born in San Francisco in 1888 to a family of saloon keepers. That is a photo of him as a young man in college. His father, Henry Biersman, had trouble holding a job and the family moved constantly. During his childhood, Charles Biersman lived in at least 11 different apartments. Architecture was changing in the 1890s. A new style was coming in, and that was Beaux-Arts, a movement that actually began in Chicago with Daniel Burnham and the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. There is Daniel Burnham. And this photo, click one more, is the administration building at the 1893 World's Fair, which was designed by, I know this one, hold on, Richard Morris Hunt, who was the first American architect to attend the School of the Beaux-Arts in Paris. Beaux-Arts architecture took its stylistic cues from the Renaissance, added steel frames, floating foundations, and elevators, and the result was a style that would dominate American architecture for the next 40 years. The most spectacular Beaux-Arts building in San Francisco was the Ferry Building, which was completed in 1898. The building took 6 years to build, and Charles Biersman walked by it almost every day. The highlight is the clock tower, which is modeled on the Giralda Tower, a 12th century bell tower in Seville, Spain. In the early 1900s, Biersman attended a trade school for poor kids where he took drafting classes and where he majored in electrical engineering. A major part of electrical engineering in those days was about lighting. So already 2 elements of the Wrigley Building have fallen into place, the clock tower and the exterior lighting. Biersman's big break, strangely, was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. It happened just before dawn on April 6th, and it leveled most of downtown San Francisco. That's San Francisco on the eve of the 1906 earthquake. One more. And there it is after the earthquake. The city began rebuilding at a furious rate, and there was a shortage of architectural draftsmen. Within months, Biersman was hired by the firm of Morgan & Hoover. Nobody remembers Hoover, but Morgan was Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan was the first woman to graduate from the School of the Beaux-Arts in Paris, and also the founder of one of the first woman-owned architecture firms in the United States. Morgan went on to have an astounding career, during which she designed more than 700 buildings, primarily in California, and many for the millionaire newspaper and magnate William Randolph Hearst. Over the next 2 years, she became Biersman's mentor. There she is. Here is an example of the work he did for her. Great. In 1910, she pulled strings and paid his tuition to get him into the architectural program at the University of Pennsylvania, which was headed by her École des Beaux-Arts classmate, the French architect Paul Klee. This is a photo from 1910 of the University of Pennsylvania architecture class, and that is Paul Klee. Beaux-Arts was more than just a style. It was also a method and a way of working. The key was what was known as the esquisse, a freehand sketch, a make-or-break exercise where students were isolated for up to 12 hours in a booth and forced to come up with a workable concept for a new building. Here is Biersman's esquisses, and one sees immediately his talent, an ornamentalist and a draftsman. Biersman graduated 2 years later and immediately began the first of 3 jobs he would hold in New York over the next 5 years. all with firms where the principals had attended the School of the Beaux-Arts in the 1890s. In 1914, Biersman won a fellowship to do a 3-month sketching tour of Italy, and here are 3 watercolors he completed on this trip. Right there. These were all hanging in his daughter's home in Stonington, Connecticut. Again, you see Biersman's great talent for thinking on his feet, for capturing the moment. And the trip also changed his self-image. Up until then, when asked what he did, Biersman said he was a draftsman, but after he got back from Italy, he started calling himself an artist. In 1917, Biersman married Beatrice Brophy, a stenographer from New Brunswick, New Jersey. And just as both sides of Biersman's family, that is her right there, both sides of Biersman's family were German immigrant saloon keepers, both sides of her family were Russian immigrant shopkeepers. How they met is unknown. He was 29 and she was 24. They honeymooned in California, stopping first in Los Angeles, where Biersman examined Julia Morgan's most recent building for William Randolph Hearst, the Los Angeles Examiner Building. There's the exterior. Here's the lobby.
Here's the interior. For years working on this, we couldn't figure out where the Wrigley Building came from. And we knew that he was, Julia Morgan was his mentor. And on a whim, we were in Los Angeles. She said, let's go see this building. And we walked in, it was the Wrigley Building inside out. It's his homage to her. And it's the Beaux-Arts, all the icon pieces of this are, Julia Morgan interpreting the Beaux-Arts. And here in the center is William Hearst's private elevator that only he was allowed to use. And so you can see she set it up as a little stage with the chain. And then I have a detail. There it is there. And then Julia clearly had a great sense of humor, which translated later into the Wrigley Building with Charles. So over the door, she puts a bear head, which is like bears are the most unruly, untamable beast on earth, and 2 angels holding it. So she was poking fun at him. Here's another detail. So you can start to see this parallel. Beautiful. It's absolutely spectacular building. Love it.
In 1919, Biersman received a job offer from Graham Anderson, Probst and White in Chicago that would change his life. Graham Anderson was Daniel Burnham's successor firm. Its chief designer was Pierce Anderson, who, like all of Biersman's employers, was a graduate of the School of the Beaux-Arts. In 1919, William Wrigley Jr. had just turned 58. Oh, that's not him. There he is. And was at the peak of his career. Born in Philadelphia, he moved to Chicago in 1891 to open a sales office for his family's soap company. And when that didn't work, he switched to selling baking powder. And when that didn't work, he began offering 2 packages of chewing gum as a premium with every can of baking powder. And that worked. Within a year, that really worked. Within a year, soap and baking powder were gone, and Wrigley was in the gum business. What's interesting about Wrigley's career is that the actual product, chewing gum, was almost an afterthought. Chewing gum is made from tree gum, flavoring, and a little sugar. It's not hard to make, and even Wrigley said anybody could make it. It's also not a staple, and nobody needs it. They have to want it. And Wrigley's true genius was knowing how to create that want. And the way to do it was advertising. That is a photo of Wrigley's first Times Square billboard, circa 1918, 1919. In many ways, Wrigley had one foot in the 19th century and one in the 20th. His heroes were people like P.T. Barnum and Buffalo Bill. His strategy was tell 'em quick and tell 'em often. In the 1920s, billboards were the primary form of consumer advertising, and Wrigley had tens of thousands of them. The most spectacular was this one, a 7-story light-up extravaganza designed by Oscar Goode, known as the Botticelli of Broadway.
But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Wrigley's billboards blanketed the country from downtown city centers to the most obscure country crossroads. The art on these boards, for the most part, was primitive. The one motif was the spearman, which you see in that photo. And again, the billboards made up in quantity and scale what they lacked in sophistication. And there's another one. Add one more. It's one of my favorites. Wait a minute, that one is it's this part of a series of gigantic cutouts along a highway in Massachusetts. So, and you can see kind of by the scale, you see the person standing there to the left. You see how huge these things were. I mean, but again, it points up that in terms of advertising, Wrigley would try anything. By the 1920s, the Wrigley Company was a top 5 national advertiser, along with General Motors, American Tobacco, Coca-Cola, and Procter & Gamble. But as successful as the country was, and it was a very successful company, it still lacked a major corporate presence in Chicago. In 1919, at the urging of Mayor William Thompson, Wrigley began scouting sites for a new headquarters building, and he knew what he wanted, a site and a building that would be the equivalent of his Times Square billboard. He found what he was looking for just across the still under construction Michigan Avenue Bridge. Michigan Avenue was brand new then. Daniel Burnham had first proposed it in his 1909 plan of Chicago. The aim was a Chicago version of Paris's Champs-Élysées, and the Wrigley Building was designed with that dream in mind. As you can see, just across the river to the left is where the Wrigley Building is today. And that's the water tower. Yeah. The site was very challenging, 10,000 square feet, 4 irregular sides, and a northeast corner that narrowed to 5 feet. Many years later, Philip Wrigley, William's son, would describe it as cockeyed all the way around, but it fronted on a vast new plaza, and whatever was built there would be visible for miles. Biersman was 31 when he began designing what would be his most famous building. There he is, holding his son Jack. Many years later, Biersman would tell his daughter that William Wrigley was his favorite client, and it's easy to see why. Wrigley's approach to architecture in many ways was the same as his approach to advertising. Go big, stand out, make people notice you. And for Biersman, it was an open-ended invitation to dig deep into his imagination and create something extraordinary. Like all Beaux-Arts architects, Biersman began with history. 2 buildings in particular played important roles in his thinking: the Giralda Tower in Spain and Chateau Chambord in France's Loire Valley. It's unknown if Biersman ever saw either one of these, but he obviously knew the Ferry Building in San Francisco, and Chambord was an icon of the Renaissance, famous for both its skyline of gables and pediments and for its incredibly lavish ornamentation. Chambord was built by King Francis I in the 15th century. It took as his emblem the mythological salamander, a beast that could live in fire. Chambord is tattooed with salamanders. They're everywhere. And so is the Wrigley Building. The Wrigley Building's facade is made up of 375,000 individual tiles of terracotta, all of which were molded and cast at Northwestern Terracotta's North Side factory. The building broke ground in early 1920 and was completed in April of 1921. The total cost was $3.7 million, equivalent today to about $60 million. One of the last features to be installed was also among the most innovative, and that's the exterior lighting. That's a blueprint showing a proposed clam, which I guess is the London Guarantee Building on the other side. It never got executed, though. Here, Biersman drew on his electrical engineering education to create a display whose only equal was Times Square. The system he designed included over 200 projectors, both hidden on the facade and roof and on various surrounding buildings. At night, the building and the flashing beacon that topped the clock tower was visible for 20 miles. And for day one, the building was a huge hit. The Tribune wrote, Well may the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa totter and tremble. Its supremacy in the tower line is menaced, if not destroyed, by the Wrigley Tower of Chicago. And a year after its completion, the Tribune asked readers to name the seven wonders of the world, and the Wrigley ranked between the pyramids of Egypt and the Panama Canal. So successful was the building, and it was fully leased before it opened, that Wrigley immediately began making plans for a second tower. Now, Bill is going to talk a few minutes about the aesthetics of the building.
Well, I'm going to go back to this because it's iconology imagery. And Wrigley really understood repeating, and using graphic imagery to use the spearman, he called it, to make it more memorable. So I teach a class in photography. I always start my students with the word elegance, and elegance represents a positive visual resolve. So elegance in architecture embodies grace, beauty, refinement, elaborate ornamentation, a sense of harmony, and a functional purpose to the building's appearance. And then in the Beaux-Arts, when you look this up, Beaux-Arts in architecture is a symmetrical architecture style marked by grandeur, ornamentation, and classical proportions with influences from the French and Italian Renaissance. So all of this is coming together with Deersman and Julia Morgan and William Wrigley and his eccentricness and bringing in this iconology. So the Beaux-Arts art sculpture functions, as we say, a moral compass using figures to communicate virtues and ethical values, and they're placed on the building to convey a moral lesson. So let's go forward. So there's the building. So where did this building come from? And what's really important in design and architecture is you can see how there are these vertical lines reaching up from the base, from the street, and it's visually lightning low to the building, it's ascending into the sky. And so we kind of have to go back in time because this is historically, he came out of the Renaissance. So this is a 15th century building in Florence, and this is designed what's called a load-bearing building. It's rock and wood, and rock is stacked in horizontals of wood, and it's stacked, and it goes up into the sky, but it's all based on weight. And the architects have to distribute emotionally the weight of the form, the weight of the building, by defining the entrance, using these arches, and then systematically going up over the door of these little square windows that lighten that first horizontal base load, then the series of horizontals going up, and it keeps getting lighter and lighter. And then finally, there's a cornice that finishes the building into the sky. Then we're going to jump to 1893. This is Louis Sullivan's Wainwright Building in St. Louis. Now, in the late 1800s, steel was introduced, and all over, architects were mystified, design-wise, what to do with steel and how to go vertical. And there are a lot of steel buildings, but finally, Sullivan is considered to define the modern skyscraper, and it gives it a base, and there's the door, and you can see those little square windows. Not that he's repeating the building in Florence, but it's distributing the visual, emotional weight of the building, and then it goes vertical. And you can see here with the horizontals and the decorativeness, and this couldn't be done with wood and rock. And then in 1921, steel is even more sophisticated. So Wrigley, or Charles Biersman for the Wrigley Building, can now kind of weave the steel in and out and make it even more delicate. So all of this is this leading up to our building. Let me move my files here. And we get to this. And it's the Wainwright Building. It's the Florence Building. There's the base. You can see the base weight being distributed and lightened. There's the vertical piers going up, and then it resolves at the top. So it comes out of a classical form. And for me, this photograph always looks like a boat sitting in the water, coming out of the water and moving north Michigan Avenue. So Biersman designs a glamorous door for a glamorous client. And it's not just any door. It's like three stories high with the arch. And then as you go up, you ascend higher, this vertical series of piers that go up to the clock tower. And he's going to define you emotionally to go up into the air and lighten the load of the building. And above that on the side are these dancing women that are in all this iconology, all this relief is put in there. So we have these women dancing on columns by the door, and in the Beaux-Arts language, they represent the transformation of time and motion. My clicker here. Come on. There. And then we have this, which is also on the top above the dancing ladies. There's a little pagoda, and there's flames, angel faces, and lions. And those in the moral compass are divine power, intellect, courage, and power. So the architect changes your emotional feeling of the building rising up to the sky, breaks the arch over the doorway with these 4 piers. Here we go. And you can see the transition now from the base going vertically up. And the piers are holding up the center of the building, and that whole center defines the column up to the very end of the clock tower. And then on top of each one of those 4 are these falcons, and the falcons represent strength. So he's always putting in these icons, iconology of what these objects are. They're not just there to be pretty, there's actually a message behind them. And then this is where things get really crazy at the Wrigley Building. You lose sight. Above those falcons, you can't see what Biersman designed, and the building is massively, massively covered with terracotta objects. So you go up, let's go back. So this is the 13th floor, and there's a whole row of eagles that wrap around the building, and eagles represent divine, all-seeing power, and they're holding up the floor, the 14th floor, that Mr. Wrigley's office is on. So Charles is having fun, just like Julia was with Wrigley. And then I love this. This is up there too. Here we have an angel with its arms stretched out, holding 2 apes. And in the Beaux-Arts, it's when you look this up and try to decipher all these messages, it's communicating between earth and heaven. The apes represent virtue, verse, vice, and folly. And there's the detail. So he's poking at Wrigley. And then we get to the top of the the main building, and the top of the building with its cornice, a crown for a king, and then each to the left and the right of the clock tower are these temples, I call them, and they're the transitional pieces like buttresses holding up the building. The building's top features a cornice and a crown fit for royalty, and with these temple-like structures that support the clock tower, the buttresses, an emotional break from the flat roof then pushes everything further up into the sky. And here, this is the final cornice, which is seashells, which represent money and love. And then the floor ornamentation represent harmony. No one can see this. This is out of your view. And there's more that's going to come up in a few more pictures that show you it was never meant to be seen. There's a term that's architecture of this period it was for the eyes of God. So there's another one of the temples, and you can see the embellishment. It's astounding how much is up there. And that's the 5-foot corner looking up. And come on. And there you can see the
Salamander.
the salamander. Here. And those little boxes are called cartouches, and they're little boxes to tell stories with these icons in them. So the salamander in the crown is power to withstand and being conquer. There's fish, angels, eagles, lions, floral patterns. All of this represents prosperity, growth, courage, wisdom, enlightenment, and royalty. For me, this represents Biersman acting out in the Beaux-Arts an iconology of William Wrigley's brain. There's another detail of a salamander. And there's another detail of that on the side. And there's the detail of, let's go back. Look how dense that is. And no one could see this. And they still can't. And there's a detail of the salamander. There's that we saw. Come on. And now we get to the clock tower. Okay. Now, Okay, the clock tower you see the rosettes. The rosettes represent power and prosperity. And this is the top of the clock tower, and that's the only round structure on the whole building, this cupola. It's very fascinating how that works. And then at the end, there's this spire, and the spire going up into the heavens has got little leaves starting to grow out of it. So there's this whole thing of life and growth and continuation. And there's the hole. So all of this has to start at the sidewalk and go up. Then this is where I kind of got really confused as a photographer what to do because this is an addition put on 2 years later. And how did Biersman have to think about connecting these two different buildings? Because he had to bridge a space between the buildings that was there then that was underground. That was an open space with train tracks running underneath it. And they were running at grade. So here Biersman had really had to solve a creative problem, and he created this arcade down at the bottom. So when we were doing research, Robert dug up this newspaper article in San Francisco Journal, when Charles was working for Julian Morgan, and he studied voice training. And he was a tenor. He's actually a pretty good singer, actually, and he got good reviews in the paper for his performances. So he had to know about Verdi, Puccini, Mozart, Wagner. And so, with that in mind, I started doing my own looking around. And I found this illustration from the 1400s by a very famous opera set designer, Giacomo Torellini. And the more I looked at this, the more I came back to what I was trying to document, which was the proscenium arch in the arcade. And the proscenium arch, this space, over 10,000 people a day just on this side of the street walk under or through that space. So it's kind of like Wrigley made a stage set in front of the building for his audience. And this is to show you the scale. It's like an opera set. Look at the scale of that. The woman standing there, and the curtain pulls open. It's La Boheme, and you're just in awe over the proportions of what he created. And that's looking up. It curves the ceiling. It's not a flat ceiling. It's running on a diagonal. And it completely releases you emotionally further up. And that's looking out. And see down there the Michigan Avenue Bridge. And then I call this the backstage. I love this part. And then this is the north entrance. And again, it's full of all these iconology. There's this as you walk past the cornucopia, which is prosperity and abundance, the bird with its wings spread, which is freedom and aspiration, the head of a king, a divine right to rule, the floral patterns, the harmony between life and earth, the cycle of life, death and rebirth. And over the door, we have a pagoda with a flame, which is divine power, a dragon, which represents fearlessness, the floral, again, harmony, the devil, your choice for good or evil, the bird with its wings spread, imagination. All this ornamentation has mystical and emotional effect, guiding you from the outside world inward and providing a moral compass for your day. And this is the water tower on the west side. And I love this structure. And this is the colonnade around it. And you can see the detailing. And that's the crown. And that's the final top of the north building. I always call this the pilot house. And here's the last of my shot. This is the pilot house, and this is what's steering the building like a ship north, and with the spire blossoming again with the little leaves into the building to the sky. William Wrigley received significant value for his investment. He always did. Charles Biersman was a great artist that applied his cultural and ethical values along with exceptional sense of humor to create this remarkable structure.
The 1920s were Biersman's golden age, during which he designed numerous buildings, including the Strauss Building on Michigan Avenue, which is the one with the pyramid and the beacon on top, the Foreman Bank Building on LaSalle Street, the Continental Bank Building, and the Trimble Tower train station in Cleveland, which was the second tallest building when it was finished. His last major project was a diorama for the 1933 Century of Progress exposition. The Tribune described it as the work of a man of genius. It had a budget of $60,000, the equivalent of 1 million today, and involved the talents of over 100 artists, engineers, and sculptors. And it depicts the generation and distribution of electricity. Biersman and his generation represented the final flowering of the Beaux-Arts movement in the United States, which began with Daniel Burnham and the 1893 World's Fair, and ultimately resulted in the creation of some of the country's most important and beloved landmarks. In 1932, William Wrigley died and was succeeded by his son, Philip Wrigley. That's Philip Wrigley, the day after his father died, actually. Several weeks later, Philip held a press conference and announced that, quote, "We have made no changes and will make none. I and no one else hope to fill my father's shoes." And that is pretty much how it went for the Wrigley Company for the next half century. The one thing Philip did do was upgrade the advertising by hiring Otis and Dorothy Shepard to be his in-house advertising team.
This is the coolest couple in the world.
The Shepards, both of whom were from California, were a fascinating couple. He was a Bauhaus-influenced graphic designer, and she was an artist and a painter in a style that freely referenced Picasso, Matisse, and Modigliani. The Shepards came on board in the early 1930s and stayed until the early 1960s. They introduced a new note of glamour and sophistication to Wrigley's advertising. Yeah. In the late 1930s, Otis Shepard created the Doublemint twins, who would remain a fixture of Wrigley's advertising for 70 years. In 1937, Dorothy designed Wrigley's latest Times Square billboard. It cost $1 million and was the largest neon installation in the world. Now, there's a lot of history and stories about the Wrigley Building, and Tim is now going to discuss two aspects of that history, the clock and the role the building played as a major center for recording popular music.
Well, it seems like whenever there's a book project or an architectural history project, I get a kind of unusual role. And so it's kind of like the guy on the sportscast that does the color commentary. I come up with all the strange stories. I'm the one that finds the grasshoppers climbing up the side of the Wrigley Building. I'm the one that scans eBay trying to find souvenir bottle openers with pictures of the Wrigley Building on it. And so, interspersed with all the wonderful architectural history and photography, you'll find sandwiched in little vignettes that I added of just kind of strange, little interesting stories about the Wrigley. And one of the topics that I decided to really emphasize is the clock. Now, certainly, a clock is an important thing in a building in that period because wristwatches, people didn't wear them that much. It was pocket watches that you'd have in your pocket. And so clocks were a symbol of place and center. And so Wrigley giving the Wrigley Building a clock, in fact, it was known very much as the Wrigley clock. So it became an instant landmark. And part of it was that every time you looked at that clock to find out what time it was, you thought the name Wrigley. So people coming up and down the street would see it. Now, the interesting thing of having this wonderful public timepiece is on the Wrigley Building, there was one little bit of a downside to it. It kept lousy time. But not only did it keep lousy time, but when the building opened in April of 1921, next picture, please. Look, Ma, no hands. The Wrigley Building opened and for several months had no hands at all. For some mysterious reason, they didn't arrive, and people would make jokes about this big tower with no hands on it. The newspapers had a field day with this, including the Chicago Tribune that was right across the street. They actually made a suggestion that a statue of Venus de Milo be put on the top of the Wrigley Building to go with the hands, the clock with no hands. Next, please. Finally, in terms of July 4th, 1920, the hands arrived. It even made front page news in the Chicago newspapers. Next, please. And here's William Wrigley on the roof of the building, proudly showing and announcing their arrival. Giant wood hands. I mean, these things were mounted. They were actually fairly lightweight. I have an extra set of them in my office, and you can actually carry them around fairly easily. Next, please. Now, the Wrigley clock itself was the state of the art for like 1885. The only thing that was really available were the clocks that were made for years by the E. Howard Company in Boston. And they provided the clocks for county courthouses and across the country. And they were known as good clock. But if you look at this clock, and that's the actual Wrigley clock, it is decorated with pinstriping and decoration that's right out of the 19th century. Now, it may have worked great for some old courthouse in the 1880s, didn't work so well for a giant clock on Chicago's Michigan Avenue. Next, please. And not only did it have trouble keeping time, but the hands would register different times on the different faces. I mean, this was going on throughout, and the newspapers had a field day with this. In fact, one of the things that was said that in the Chicago Tribune, that reporters would blame missed deadlines by saying they were watching the Wrigley clock. Next, please. Here is a little poem. It goes, hickory dickory dock, a curse on the Wrigley clock. Are its works grown sticky with chewing gum? Can it be that in winter its hands are numb? They roam o'er its face with gesture beery, and aimless wandering, embarrassed and weary. It speeds or it lags till it drives us frantic. We can't keep up with its whimsy and antic. Oh, Mr. Wrigley, please fix your clock that goes hickory dickory dock. And the papers were filled with these things. They had a field day with this crazy clock. Next, please. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is urban legends that build up. And often you know a story that you research them and you find it's absolutely not true. One is that if you go online, you will find so many things online, because you have to believe everything online, of course, that says that the famous Harold Lloyd comedy, Safety Last from 1923, is the Wrigley Building clock. Well, of course it's not. I mean, it doesn't look anything like it, but people have come, I think it'll even show you how famous the Wrigley Building clock is, that people have naturally assumed that that was the site of that filming. But there is a grain of truth to it. So, no, was Harold Lloyd at the Wrigley Building? Absolutely not. However, Harold Lloyd was announced as making a publicity tour to publicize Safety Last in 1923. It was announced in the papers that Harold Lloyd was going to be hoisted up on a bosun's chair to the clock, and he was going to break a bottle of champagne against it and christen it Big Bill instead of Big Ben, in honor of the blowhard mayor, William Hale Thompson. Well, this was fine. It was in the paper, except nobody bothered to tell Harold Lloyd about this. So he comes to town, and they tell him, well, here's what we have in store for you. And he goes to the site, and he looks at it beforehand, and he looks at it, and his exact words were, "No way, brethren." And so actually people did show up to see Harold Lloyd get hoisted to the top of the clock and break that bottle of champagne, but it didn't happen. They tried to save face and say that the studios didn't want to risk potentially killing one of their most famous stars by falling off the Wrigley Building. So anyway, that's the way that story works. Next, please. And here, even when the clock would stop for periodic washing of the building, now the building would get washed like a dinner plate. I mean, in Chicago city air, the terracotta had a glaze on, but you could actually wash it. And you could watch people clean. It got dirty pretty fast back in its early days. And you'd have to stop the clock because the hands could potentially sweep the workmen right off their scaffolds into the street. but it'll show you the kind of the fame that that clock has, and even including it periodically. Next, please. It's very popular to tell you when it's time to change from daylight savings time or the other way around. And photographers love to use trick angles to make it appear that human-sized people are physically changing the time on the clock. So it's coming up soon. Next, please. Now, the next part of the story, just a little side story here, is you look at the formality of the Wrigley Building and its things to the French chateaus and classical details. But it also had a large part of a grounding in popular culture. It was for the headquarters for the broadcasting WBBM of the Columbia Broadcasting System. But the part that almost nobody has paid attention to was that one of the studios was dedicated for making records. And really famous records were made in the Wrigley, but ones that you would never, ever think of being made in Chicago, much less the Wrigley Building. I mean, what if I told you that Chicago is the center of giving popular birth to bluegrass music? Well, it was. In fact, here's the recording of Blue Moon in Kentucky, one of the most famous bluegrass records by the master of really the pioneer of Bill Monroe. And Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. That recording was made in the Wrigley Building in a studio that, heck, you'd walk. Actually, it's interesting. You want to see where the studio is. It's now a Walgreens in there. You take the escalator up to the second floor and you go to where the adult diapers are. And that's where the studio was. And I actually take my telephone with music on it, and I'll take people there. And I'll be standing amidst those diapers, and I'll be playing this music, and the clerk's telling me, "What are you doing here?" Oh, now they go, "Oh, you again." Anyway, but here's Bill Monroe, and this is, but Roy Acuff made some of his most recordings. So before Nashville was the center of country recording, actually Chicago was, because it was a good route to be able to access. The Carter family made many of their most famous records there, and it goes on and on. Next, please. And then, of course, the other part of it is Chicago is a center for the blues. And so Memphis Mini, and that is the OK label, it was a subsidiary of Columbia that had, they called it Race Records at the time. But the famous like Memphis Mimi and Me and My Chauffeur was recorded at the Wrigley Building. Earlier recordings of Willie Dixon was made at the Wrigley Building, and really kind of amazing variety of people you never would have expected at the Wrigley at all. Now, one other kind of interesting story that comes with this is, I'll tell you, is one day ago, Benny Goodman was a good Chicago boy. He gets successful, but he's now living in New York City with a successful band that's touring the country. And he is performing at a hotel in downtown Chicago. And while he's here, he is going to make some recordings at the Wrigley Building studio with his band. So anyway, his vocalist, Helen Forrest, had recently quit. He was auditioning a new vocalist for his band, and he was going to use this session to be able to give her her first recording opportunity. Shows up at the Wrigley Building studio, and who is there but John Hammond? If you know recording history, John Hammond was really one of the great people of discovering talent in the recording business, very famous. And he didn't get along with Goodman very much. So anyway, Hammond is listening to the rehearsal, and he tells Goodman about the new vocalist. Don't use her. She can't sing. She's no good. Well, Goodman wasn't the kind of guy to take that kind of garbage out of John Hammond. So they go ahead and record, and there you get the first recording ever of, ta-da, Peggy Lee. Okay, so anyway, that's some of the little vignettes. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Early 2000s, the Wrigley Company was experiencing growing pains. At a time when candy and snack food companies were consolidating and turning themselves into conglomerates, the Wrigley Company was still going it alone, with brands like Spearmint and Juicy Fruit that had been introduced over a century ago. And meanwhile, the building was showing its age. The building had sat out the tech revolution. Internet coverage was very spotty. Video was non-existent. The vacancy rate started climbing in the 1990s and eventually reached 60%. Many downtown leasing agents had never been inside the building. In 2008, the Wrigleys called it a day. And when the Mars company offered them $23 billion for the company, they accepted instantly. And the building went along as part of the deal, but with the understanding that it would eventually be sold, which it was, to BDT Capital, a venture capital firm that undertook an $82 million top to bottom renovation that included replacing the building's 2,000 windows and restoring the 375,000 terracotta blocks. This is a drawing showing the condition of the terracotta and what needed to be replaced, what needed to be repaired, what was okay. And here is the restored lobby. What's authentic here are the fixtures, the clock, the chandeliers, and the mailbox, and the elevator doors and cabs. All of these were designed by Charles Beers. There you see the salamanders. A century ago, the Wrigley Building pioneered the creation of Michigan Avenue, fulfilling Daniel Burnham's dream of a street that would rival Paris's Champs-Élysées. The Wrigley Building itself is fully leased and is back in business as a creative hub and art incubator. It remains what it always has been, the most famous building in Chicago. And how famous is this building?
Wait. We have our funder.
Wait, I forgot to show Joe's picture. There he is.
Here's the owner.
He's a good guy. Okay. And how famous is the Wrigley Building? Let's show him.
Well, here it is in a
No,
postcard. I know. This is this crazy thing that went on for over 4 years of collecting on eBay and in flea markets little objects that all were souvenirs for the Wrigley Building, and they weren't made by Wrigley. They were made by the vendors on the street and little stores because everybody loved the building so much. They took things like this home with them. It's all over the place.
No. Anyone can make gum, William Wrigley said. The trick is to sell it. Chicago was the ultimate mercantile city, and the Wrigley Building was conceived as a tribute to salesmanship. But it was also a place where a group of artists and craftspeople came together to create a work of staggering beauty and complexity. Recently, Bill and I were watching Ken Burns' documentary on the Brooklyn Bridge, and the documentary ends with a quote by the architect Louis Kahn that I think applies perfectly to the Wrigley Building. Here's the quote: "The creation of art is not the fulfillment of a need, but the creation of a need. The world never needed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony until he created it, and now we could not live without it." Thank you. Mm, 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 mm. Who was also a collaborator on this project, and Allison Cuddy will be our moderator. We'll be talking about this.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Thanks all for being here. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you all, three of you.
Everyone? Yes.
Here we go.
Got it. I didn't know I had to turn it on. Hello, everyone. Let's give them another round of applause for a wonderful presentation. So we're going to talk for a little bit. We're going to stick with the outside of the building for a minute, then go inside, and then try and get a couple of questions in from the audience. So I wanted to start with John Vinci, an amazing architect and preserver of Chicago's architecture, who's had a long relationship with this building, starting when he was 15 years old, seeing it from across the way from the top of the Tribune building. But you've in your introduction to the book, talk about the way that this building or ensemble, because it's really buildings, not building, created a sense of place there. Can you talk about that?
I mean, in my time, the
Oh.
Wrigley Building.
Sorry, Joe. We're just
Oh,
gonna.
got the wrong one. In my time, the Wrigley Building was part of an ensemble. Every postcard you saw included the Tribune Tower, the London Guarantee, the Jewelers Building, and the Wrigley Building. And the Wrigley Building's detail and history were lost. They were part of the streetscape. And the streetscape was amazing because the bridge with the Voskuil Bridge, which crossed Michigan Avenue, uh, flew or gapped Kinsey Street, Hubbard Street, Illinois, and Grand, and it made an underclass under that street. So it created a whole new environment for Michigan Avenue, and Michigan Avenue then continued to have buildings like the McGraw-Hill Building, the Palmolive Building, and most of all, the um, Diana Court Building, which was extraordinary because the lobby gapped the slope of the street. And so inside was a lobby which had different levels with glass railings by, what's his name? Edgar Miller, and there was a sculpture by Carl Milles, and it was a beautiful, beautiful ensemble. And the Wrigley Building was, of course, part of that. And what what Robert Shiroff and Bill Zabarin have done is they've taken this building and they tried to put it in the forefront of this whole ensemble. And by researching it, they not only answer a lot of questions, but they also pose a lot of questions. For example, what would have happened if it wasn't the Wrigley Building? Suppose Louis Sullivan built a building which had been much more austere, but the ornament would have had much more meaning than the ornament of the Wrigley Building. For example, a salamander is a nice little symbol, but who who knows or cares about it in terms of the whole ensemble, or who cares about these little meanings? Even though Bill has brought them to the forefront, they're not as important as when Sullivan made a building that grew out of nature and the whole building expressed one idea. I mean, we're talking about many ideas as opposed to one idea. Or suppose Mies van der Rohe came along and they had torn down the Wrigley Building and made a building on that site. It would be known for Mies's austerity and strength and proportion. It would, oh yeah, I'm losing my train of thought. So we have to be grateful for what Robert and Bill have done, is to give us a way of interpreting this complicated building and to make it into uh, the icon it really is. And it certainly is certainly is an icon. Um, we all knew it as part of our lives. We all knew the Wrigley Building existed. We all knew it was there, but we didn't have this kind of insight on the building.
Yeah, I mean, you're John, you're what you're suggesting raises the question of what happened when this building was built, not just in terms of the public's response, but the architectural response to it. Like, this is a singular building. How did it fit in with what Chicago architecture was at that moment in the early 1920s?
Well, it followed this École de Beaux-Arts idea of being, as William Barron said, they would select some Renaissance or European, some of them were Gothic, by the way, example, and they would interpret it. But these architects probably never saw the building they picked. I mean, there are many examples. The Harkness Tower at is it at Yale, I think, and the Tribune Tower. They were all built um, on classic examples, but they were not exactly copies of classic examples. That was the Beaux-Arts way of creating a building. You looked at an inspiration and you followed it through and you did wonderful drawings and you created these buildings. Well, not until architects dropped then, and mostly it's the architects of the 20s and Louis Sullivan had some play in this example, but that was the way those buildings were created. So possibly the buildings like the jeweler's building, which is the long, tall, skinny building on the south side of the river, or the Guarantee building, have these classical columns or classical forms. And so the transition goes from them to more slim buildings, like what would be the first, probably the Michigan Avenue Square. Is one of the one with the Diana Court, would be early one. They started the movement toward modernism. We could also pin this modernism to Eliel Saarinen, who was the second runner-up for the Chicago Tribune Tower.
Right.
And he came up with this extraordinary building, and he was actually possibly the winner, but Howells was related to the Tribune family, and they had made the decision a day earlier. So unfortunately, Errol Saarinen was moved to second place.
Yeah. Can you imagine having that building across from the Wrigley Building?
A good old Chicago rigging there. So
Right. Yeah. I guess I'm curious, obviously the influences for Beersman that you uncovered in doing this work and photographing the building and in researching the building were, as you said earlier, these examples from the Renaissance, the Giralda Tower, and Chateau Chambord. Do you think that Beersman surpassed them in creating the Wrigley Building?
Was what?
Did he surpass those Renaissance examples in
I don't
creating
know
the
if he surpassed them, but he
Can you-
adapted them. I don't know if he surpassed them, but he adapted them to a modern environment. I mean, what's interesting about the Wrigley is that, for one thing, it's completely irregular. And I mean, a Beaux-Arts building by definition is completely symmetrical. The Wrigley building is completely asymmetrical. I mean, and yet I always feel like Beersman, by nature of the site, which was irregular, was sort of forced to do an interesting building. I mean, it's not a square, it's not a rectangle. I mean, it's four unequal sides. It's different from every angle. Um, it's never really, strangely, gotten the respect it deserves in Chicago. I mean, because of these modernists barging in and, they're replacing everybody else.
was netting the agenda?
The level of skill and art in that building is astounding. I mean, which would you rather look at, the Wrigley Building or another metal grid? I mean,
It was Wrigley Building. Every piece of the Wrigley Building is handmade. It's hand drawn, it's hand carved, it's hand cast, it's fired in clay and ovens, and it had to be pre-assembled outside the building so the pieces fit together. So you're looking at a handmade object. It's a craft. It's a work of art. It's a sculpture.
one of the interesting irony of this building is that it is, I think I can say with confidence, Chicago's most famous building. Everybody knows it. And so we have many great works of architecture that people come from around the world to see. But the Wrigley Building is one that is picked up more in popular culture. It was extensively written about in the newspapers. It was joked about. It shows up in popular culture. But when you looked at the assessments of Chicago's architecture, in fact, the early edition of Chicago's famous buildings, it's not there at all. It's an anomaly. It doesn't fit in. But because of that, it's a building you notice. It's a building you remember. You can tell somebody, take me to the Wrigley Building, and they'll know exactly what you're talking about.
Does that also have to do with one of the things you read about in the book is that Wrigley never licensed the image of the building so that it was a building that could circulate through popular culture easily. Nobody ever had to pay to use the likeness.
Yeah, I mean, all those souvenirs, none of them were made by Wrigley. In fact, the building rarely shows up in Wrigley's advertising. In fact, a lot of businesses love to show their headquarters or our building in their ads. Wrigley did occasionally, but not that much. But leave it to the people who made the little cheesy souvenirs that you could buy at the downtown souvenir shop. They were cranking out those ashtrays and paperweights and postcards and you name it. And it's even fun to get these old postcards and you read the messages on the back, and people are commenting about the building. So it's a unique building that everybody remembers. And again, I would argue the most famous building in Chicago.
I want to ask about. I want to go inside the building as well and talk a little bit more. You pulled out some of the great stories of the Wrigley Building, Tim. But I mean, really, this building is the crossroads of America in the most American city. And if you think about anything that happened in the 20th century in terms of culture and narratives, it happened in the Wrigley Building. Art, architecture, sports, advertising, entertainment, impresarios, technology, it's all there. So was it a matter of if you build it, they will come? How did the inside of the Wrigley Building become so transformative?
Well, the building was an escape. The first escape from the congested downtown of Chicago, which was the whole idea of what North Michigan Avenue was supposed to be. And so it was, even though when it was first built, it was surrounded by really cheesy low rise factories. So right next to the Wrigley Building was a warehouse for the Piggly Wiggly grocery store, a big sign saying Piggly Wiggly on it. But it all caught up very quickly. And so it was like Tom Sawyer painting the fence. The buildings start to appear around it. But there was a whole kind of a culture of people who saw this building as a place that didn't quite fit into the congestion and the chaos of downtown Chicago. People like advertising agencies and commercial artists. Here was a place that you were on your own. It was a place of light and of air. And the building even just kind of naturally attracted a very distinctive tenancy that didn't fit in the old downtown or it didn't fit in the loop.
That's interesting. So it's like a new culture being created. Bill?
I was going to just say the radio station.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole part of this was the radios and broadcasting. In fact, some of the very earliest radio, in fact, the origins of WGN actually were in the Wrigley Building, where two kind of hobbyists had ties to Wrigley. And of course, all hobbyists back in the early 20s were trying to get the biggest antenna they could. And of course, they were able to use the whole building as their antenna. And first it was just experimental broadcast, but then what if you bring a band in there and play? And
They had a 50-piece orchestra every day show up.
yeah, but then the second floor, and actually the radio station went all the way from the basement into the second floor. Many of the soap operas and national broadcasts were done out of the Wrigley Building. In the basement was the sound effects room where they had car doors that you could slam and just all kinds of horns that you could blow. And so it was an interesting mix. And if you wanted to meet a celebrity, one of the places to go if they were in town is hang around the Wrigley Building because they would go for radio interviews at the station there.
It also had a great restaurant, right?
Well, the restaurant started out very simply, but then you were by yourself. And so you had to establish a restaurant because there was nothing around it. And it evolved into the great Wrigley Building restaurant. That's a whole culture in itself with, a really famous chef who's the king of the salads.
Yes, but who's the chef for the Wrigley? Arnold Shirtcliffe was the famous chef at the Wrigley Building. But I mean, point that's interesting is that the Wrigley has always had this high-low contrast. I mean, yes, you had this radio station that was playing popular music, uh, but I mean, it also the Arts Club of Chicago was also headquartered in the Wrigley Building for 20 years. And I mean, in the 1930s, just about every major artist you can think of in the 1920s and 30s had a show there. I mean, Picasso's Guernica was shown at the Wrigley Building in the 1930s. People like, I mean, Picasso, Modigliani, Dali, just about anybody you can think of had a show at the Wrigley Building. At the same time, there was all this soap operas happening on WBBM, and it's always had this high-low aspect to it. In addition to the fine art, there was advertising art.
But this is all history. It's not architecture. I mean, the point the book makes, and I agree, is that the architecture should be singled out and given more attention. But the history it's astounding. I mean, I think.
I mean, there is something that you all point out that this is obviously in the book makes the point, as John's saying, it's an architecturally significant building. It's an anomaly, but it's also, but it at the same time, it's not a well-known building, right? And I wonder, like Bill, you've allowed us to see the building in a way that we couldn't before, or you've unearthed these stories. So I wonder what kept people from really understanding the building.
Well, the building, when when we started the book, it was an architecture book, but then as the time went on and Robert and Tim did more research, they started finding out all the stuff that no one's talked about. And then I started getting up on rooftops and hanging out windows and seeing all this incredible stuff that I had never seen that I can't even find documented. And it took 4 years and it just kept evolving. And it is a high and low, but it didn't start off that way. I think we were telling a story that's never been put together and told of the building physically and the culture inside.
Right. And also architectural history in your discovery of Beersman and his story,
Correct.
which doesn't end very happily. I mean, the second building is not done by Beersman. And so I wonder, could you talk a little bit about, or am I getting that? I thought his nemesis was involved in the finishing of the building.
Well, from my
I think this was a product of the big corporation taking architects and disposing of them, or the competition within the office. And it is a kind of tragic history. For example, Alfred Shaw becomes the successor to Beardsman. Isn't that true?
That's
Yes.
true.
And Alfred Shaw goes on to do this opera house, lyric opera house, and the Merchandise Mart. I mean, we could see that Beardsman probably didn't leave because there was no work, or there was maybe because of the depression. Could it be because of the depression?
Oh, it was very definitely the Depression.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but there is this problem in these big offices of competition. I always point to Walter Netch and Bruce Graham competing at SOM. And then there's this story I heard recently. There's an oral history of Bill Hartman, who was the official head of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in my time. And in his oral history, he says that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's history should not be recorded. It's not important. So you have people like Bill Hartman, who were tough guys. I once told him I had admired the Brunswick building, and he said, "Oh, I designed that." Well, he had nothing to do with the Brunswick. he was probably the man who, wrote the checks. Uh, but anyway, that just shows that there was this fierce competition in these large offices, and that probably goes back even before the large office.
Tim, you were going to jump.
Well, I was going to jump in.
Yeah,
I thought the second edition, from my perspective, I can still see Charles Biersman's hand in the terracotta, in the drawing, and in the rendering. And I didn't get in the book, but even in the second building up at the top, he's got a row of chickens, which I think might play into what John's saying. Maybe the corporate part of it was taking over, but he was still having fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, a part that I think is valuable in the book and also with highlighting Charles Biersman is a really a broad misunderstanding of how a large architectural office worked. In fact, everything you'll ever see about the Wrigley Building, if you look it up in most of the guidebooks, it'll say architect Graham Anderson, Probst, and White. Yes, they were. This was the firm that was in charge of it. However, the way these offices worked, or offices like Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and others, is that there were people who were responsible for individual projects and then had great leeway in creating them. Biersman is a certain idea of somebody who really designed. Did Graham Anderson or Probst and White do it? No. Some of them were around at the time. But in any of these offices, it's the people who'd actually designed them that their name gets totally forgotten. So this is not only a good example for highlighting Charles Biersman, but I think also making people think about who really is behind great works of architecture
Yeah.
made by major architectural offices.
I wanted to ask you because we did a version of this event earlier this spring at the Arts Club, and I know you've gotten a lot of response to the book, but the story of kind of recovering the Wrigley Building continues. And where has that gone? What else is coming out of the book? What are you working on now related to the Wrigley?
What are we working on now?
Yeah, or what have you continued to discover about the book? Or
One of the things we discovered, because we got, thanks to Joe Mansueto, carte blanche to be all over the building, in the second sub-basement, we discovered hundreds of the original drawings just piled and stacked and in boxes. And we've dragged most of them up to a third floor conference room and have them laid out on tables. And we're getting ready to sort those now and come up with a permanent archive of these drawings.
Yeah, Joe actually wants to create a kind of a private museum at the Wrigley Building with all of the original drawings as well as architectural fragments and other documents and things like that. Um, it's been a fascinating project, and I mean, the book, how it turned out, is so different from how it was planned.
Right. We even found in the basement a wooden crate bigger than this table, nailed shut, that Robert said, "We got to open it up." I said, "I'm too tired. I'm going home." We finally pried it open, and there's an original artwork from the Shepherds. And there's very, very little artwork in the world left, original artwork from Otis and Dorothy Shepherd. And it's this rare find, this crate.
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's original Otis Shepherd lithographs from the 1930s and 40s, still in their wrappers. I mean, say there's 2 dungeon rooms in the basement there, one for the blueprints and one for everything the Wrigley Company didn't want when they moved out of the building.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're still going through that stuff right now.
Well, thank you for uncovering it and continue to work with it. It's an amazing book. 3 portfolios of photographs by Bill, amazing narrative by Robert, 8 delightful essays by Tim. We've only scratched the surface, but we do want to give you a chance to ask this distinguished panel a question or two before we wrap up. So we have microphones. Just raise your hand if you have a comment or a question, and we'll try and get to you. And I see someone in the back there.
And a gentle reminder to keep it to questions only and limit any commentary. Please keep your questions brief, clear, and speak directly into the microphone to be heard. We'll take our first question there on the left, near the center.
Oh, my question is related to all of the ornamentation. I presume Beardsman drew it all himself? And how is it produced?
How was the ornamentation produced?
Yeah, did Beersman draw it?
They're all original drawings. I think Tim can fill us in on that deeper.
The drawings for the ornament would have been done by Beersman, or also there are people he was working with and under his supervision. Then it goes to the terracotta company. In fact, a lot of the original drawings were on tissues that were then provided to the terracotta company, who had sculptors on staff. And the sculptor for this building was Fritz Albert, who's famous for doing the Reby storage building on Clark Street. But he was the chief modeler. Interpret the drawings. They would photograph the models, send them to the architects, or the architect and Beersman, they'd go down to the terracotta company and see if it needed tweaking and give recommendations on it. And then there's the whole manufacturing process of terracotta. We'd be here all night if I did that whole thing. But basically, it went from these beautiful pencil and charcoal drawings to the sculptors at the terracotta company.
So
It's called Northwestern Terracotta at Clyburn Avenue near Diversey.
so nothing on the building is out of a catalog. It's all original sketching.
And each piece is hand pressed in a mold by hand. The blocks are hollow, and it had to be, and it only could be. And if you look inside any one of the blocks, you will find the fingerprints of the people who put their hands inside the clay back in 1920, 21.
How many total pieces of terracotta? Robert,
total?
how many total?
I want the grand total, please.
375,000. So
Excellent. We can take another
they
question.
were all numbered too. They all had to be assembled that way. Mhm. Sure. Who do we got?
Hi, I have a quick question about the little gerbil run around the 14th floor or so, connecting the two buildings. Do we know what that is for? Nobody seems to have a good answer about that.
What's going around it?
Well, the bridge.
The little bridge connecting the two buildings.
Oh, yes.
So the Wrigley Company occupied multiple 2 floors in the building, and they determined that actually too much time was taken to go up and down the staircase. And so they actually built that bridge connecting the 2 buildings to extend the Wrigley office at the same level on the same floor. It was added later. The tailing of it probably is Alfred Shaw, who then had taken over designing after Beersman had left the firm.
Do you know about when that was? Was it shortly after the buildings were built?
No. It didn't happen until about I believe it's 1932.
Thank you.
We'll take our next question there on the left.
I have a comment and a question. At one time, when I was a temporary secretary, I was assigned a job in Wrigley Building in a room that had a triangular room that had no windows. I was there for 1 day. That was not pleasant. But my question is about the electric lights that shine. The electric lights that shine on the building, when they were first installed, and what happened when there was a point when they were not being used.
The lighting was intended from the Wrigley was fascinated with the power of electricity to get your attention, including that electric sign that you saw in those pictures in Times Square. And so plans were made for lighting that would light up on some of the roof lines, but also from buildings across the way. And it was actually, they experimented with different kinds of lighting to the building. It was intensified at the time of the 1933 fair, where they wanted it to be like daylight. It was more dramatic effects in the early days of the lighting. But it was something. It was also a lot of attention was given to it when the lights went off during World War II, where they talked about blackouts. And actually, what they did was they took the lights off the Wrigley Building and they installed them temporarily around Wrigley Field, where they experimented with night baseball using the Wrigley Building lights. When the war was over, they put them back on the building.
No, it's perfect because Charles Biersman, as a child, was so poor he couldn't go to college or go to school, and he got himself into a free trade school in San Francisco. It was set up by a philanthropist, and what he studied was architectural drawing and electricity, which was very early. So these incredible lines of the universe cross with this building for him being fascinated as a young man with electricity and light and becoming an architect.
And originally it had a beacon on the top that spun around. And for a while, the Wrigley was the tallest building in Chicago. And not only would this beacon turn around, but it would change color as it spun. And the idea that you could see it quite a distance into the Chicago neighborhoods. Unfortunately, they changed the zoning ordinance right after the building was under construction. And so taller buildings were built, and they had to turn the beacon off because, like, people in the Tribune Tower would suddenly have some unwanted colored lighting coming into their office. It happened. It happened to the Palmolive building.
We have time for one final question here up front.
Well, gentlemen, yeah, does this work? Yeah. Gentlemen, a very interesting talk. And I see the Wrigley Building as a statement about geometry, basically. And it sort of breaks the symmetry because of that weird plot it was on, that 5 thing. But of course, this is Euclidean geometry. And you can imagine remapping this structure in what's known as hyperbolic geometry. It's a perfectly consistent geometry. And in Euclidean geometry, if I have a paper and I draw a straight line at a point, I can only draw one parallel line through that point. In hyperbolic geometry, the number is infinite. So you could have a fun time, I think, remapping this building into a 3D hyperbolic structure and see what you get.
Yeah, it certainly would. And I mean, it really is an unusual site that caused a challenge. It also was a challenge in terms of laying out the interior. And there are rooms that are in some of those areas where it comes to a really narrow prow, where it gets pretty tight quarters in there. But working, I mean, it's certainly, this is a building that in design, being governed by that kind of geometry, this building probably drove everybody who worked on it nuts, trying to accommodate everything to these unusual angles. That was part of that fitting. But it was an old wharfing site that used to be on the river. Never ever thought about a skyscraper ever being built there, but it was the available land, and it was one that you could see from far down the street. And the shape is part of what you notice.
What's great is Wrigley was quoted saying he chose that site because Michigan Avenue bends over the river and heads northeast. And from Roosevelt Road all the way up there, that would be the only thing you could see.
Brilliant.
Very brilliant.
So just a quick reminder, if we want to see other of Biersman's works, Biersman Chicago, where should we go?
You should go to Union Station and see all the ornamentation. Yes. The torchieres, the lights, the handrails on the stairs, the doors, the brass elevator doors. It's all his hand with little bugs and caterpillars and butterflies and vines. It's spectacular.
But also look at the Strauss building at Michigan Avenue and Jackson, which for having the big blue beehive on the top. And when that building was built, it wasn't just a static blue beehive. It was actually something that used to strobe different colors on and off, very in different progressions. So that's another good one to see. Also, if you go to what was the old American National Bank at the corner of Washington and LaSalle Street, of course, they're kind of stinky about letting you see them now. But if you can get in to see the elevators, they're beautiful bronze work. It was a bank, and it shows cherubs holding big bags of money.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much for this conversation. Thank you all for being here.